or a permanent eclipse, you never know.
Okay.
So we can maybe, should we begin now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So good, it's all 85 plus people have joined now. So good afternoon, everyone. You know that the Department of English and Cultural Studies, Panjab, Chandigarh, has started a lecture series to mark 75 years of India's independence. And as we mark this important date in our history, we also look back, we reflect at the kind of trajectories that we have traversed, the kind of journeys that we have taken as researchers, as teachers, as knowledge entrepreneurs. In this journey, we have evolved, we have taken on board trends, changes, trends, new courses, new turns in culture. And today, I'm happy to share with you that we have with us a very scholar and an old colleague, Professor Shelley Walia, who has spent almost, if I'm not mistaken, 4 decades in the department and has keenly seen, not just seen as a passive bystander, but who has participated feverishly in this turn of events. One who has, I could say, I can use that stereotypical phrase, seen it all. How the department has evolved, how the discipline has evolved, what kind of changes it has undergone. He has been not just a witness, I've told you, he has been instrumental, he has played a pivotal role in shaping the department and also in also shaping the cultural studies spectrum in India. I distinctly remember that we used to have very animated discussion with him on, and you know, things, when things change, they change after dialogue, after discussions, hectic discussions, agreements, disagreements, and we were part of that happy enterprise. And I'm happy to remember all those days that I had with Professor Shelley Walia. Today, as you know, that he's going to talk to us about the making of English studies, and that itself gives you an idea that it would be a kind of a quasi-historical journey, analytical journey. English studies is always always in process. It has never, therefore, acquired that kind of a fixity of permanence. There are many young scholars here, many research scholars, many students here. We know Shelley personally, therefore we never bother to read his biodata. For the first time, perhaps I'm reading his biodata, and it looks rather too intimidating.
Then you can avoid it. You can avoid it.
No, I can avoid for my sake, but not for the audience. The audience must know the kind of profile that you have. So let me read his brief bio. Of course, I told you there are so many things. This says very little about the kind of intellectual accomplishments and contributions that he has made. So Professor Shelley Walia is professor and former Emeritus Fellow at the Department of English and Cultural Studies, Panjab University, Chandigarh. As an academic, he is trained in political and cultural theory, and as a member of the University Senate and Syndicate, as well as other positions he held during his service. He has stood up for the development in the field of liberal arts, in international affairs and social sciences, a culture that focuses on rethinking progressive pedagogy. The things that I've already just shared with you, that he has been in the vanguard of reforms in higher education, in English studies particularly. He has taught British literature, post-colonial literatures, and literary and cultural theory at the department. He was elected a visiting fellow at Wolfson College, University of Oxford in 1994, and again in 2004. He has also spent 2 years at the University of Cambridge, where he researched and published extensively on post-colonial theory and culture theory. He has been a senior fellow at the Rothermere American Institute at the University of Oxford. He has lectured on post-colonialism, multiculturalism, diasporic nations, and cultural identity over the years at the Center for Indian Studies, St. Anthony's College, Oxford. Professor Shelley Walia's writings on literary theory, politics, and culture have appeared among other journals in Race and Class, Times Literary Supplement, Social Sciences Research Journal, etc. He writes regularly on international politics, human rights, and war in a number of newspapers published in India. I hope that you must have read his articles that frequently appear in Tribune and The Hindu. His books include Evelyn Waugh, Witness to Decline, Between History and Truth, Perspectives on Culture, Politics and Theory. And other book is Edward Said and the Writing of History. His book entitled Crisis in the Humanities, something that perhaps he will touch upon today. His book entitled Crisis in the Humanities, Alternate Readings on Culture, Politics and History appeared in 2020. At present, he is working on Chomsky and International Relations, a project that has been accepted by Pluto Press London. His other project, a collection of essays on politics, globalization and human rights, is in its final stages of completion. He has also been involved in the study of interaction between race, class, gender, and politics of identity. Being a Bachelor of Laws, his other area of interest is international relations and law. Over to you, Professor Shelley Walia. Maybe 50 minutes or so, then we shall have a Q&A session thereafter.
Thank you, Akshay, very much. Somewhere I thought you were introducing someone else and not me.
It also looks to me that I'm introducing somebody who's foreigner to me.
And I must, in return, compliment you on using the word refraction in the title of the series. And I think it's very apt, for instance, and it's apt because it brings science and humanities together, especially because the electromagnetic waves across the borders affect many of us. But many of us, they leave untouched, and we carry on in that state of limbo or status quo. I thought that what I would really talk to you is my journey, actually, though I say that how did it bring us here? Maybe how did it bring me here is probably more apt. I was just thinking that if you are standing on the River Seine and looking down at the river downstream, you see far away in the horizon the Cathedral of Notre Dame. I think not the best of cathedrals that one could say, but probably the most robust in the whole of Gothic architecture. The River Seine itself, when you're looking down the river, you see crossing the bridge over to the Louvre from about 200 years, from the College of Art, students going across to study art, very much in the museum. And when I look at the roadside there, especially the left bank, and I'm mentioning the left bank, which is the south bank of the River Seine. I'm saying this because that's the end where most of the cafes are located. And I'm saying that they are located there, these cafes, because Sartre and his wife, Beauvoir, Simone de Beauvoir, and his many friends together, like Raymond Aron also, sat in these cafes, discussed matters of the world, discussed imperialism in North Africa and Algeria, discussed Nazism. What I mean to say really is that when I look at civilization and I see it, I recognize it. Maybe many of us won't be able to define it. But I think when you see it, you know that that is civilization. John Ruskin, I think, was very right when he said there are three books of civilization. One is the book of music, the other is the book of art, and the third is the book of letters. Each is important to civilization, I think. One complements the other. And I'm saying this because I think a student of literature sort of covers all these three books. Sooner or later in his career, he does get attracted to modernism and classicism and begins to study art and architecture. I, in fact, have three priorities, I think, when I look at civilization around. Three priorities of art and criticism. When you look at it, they do get your sensibility. But we being literary critics, we like to evaluate. The evaluation of the judgment. The second priority that I think is the aesthetic aspect. And then, along with that, the third one is the moral. There is a kind of a intentional aspect to it also, which is the author's point of view, the source of it. But I think that is not very important when you're really looking at the Cathedral of Notre Dame. You're not thinking of who made it. Or when you're reading a poem, it's the poem that really gets you. There could be a motive also in the arts and in English studies and language and culture, and that is the motive of nationalism or imperialism. If you were to look back, and I'm not going to really look into the origins because we are quite suspicious of origins. We've been taught that as a pedagogical exercise with us. But I think that when I talk about civilization, one does talk in terms of literacy. Literacy in the Renaissance times, and people were learning Latin and learning Greek. The reason that they were asked to learn this, especially in England, in Great Britain, the reason I think was that by learning Latin and Greek, you understood the syntax much better. You understood grammar much better. That's one of the reasons I think that Shakespeare put his learning of Latin and Greek to good use and therefore mastered the language. Literacy, in fact, is the mark of respectability, as we all know. That's why you want to be literate. I'm not saying the non-literate are not respectable, but I think that literacy is a kind of a mark of respectability. But style and accomplishment or judgment, style and judgment is what you actually possess, the potential that you have. If you can sort of come to that kind of an accomplishment of judgment, of knowing, without being told that this is civilization. What I have in mind is actually the inculcation of taste and appreciation of good writing, and promoting higher standards of literacy through reading and writing. The first thing that was there when the schools were introduced in the 18th century in England, for instance, or around Europe, the idea was to learn language and have high standards of language, I think, because the emphasis was on the spoken and written word, which I don't think we emphasize that much in our departments. But the spoken and the written were the most important aspects of. You started having to civilize the world and bring it to a literate standard. You started having anthologies. But let me just skip that whole history of English studies and mention one thing, that the senior most professor at the University of Edinburgh in 1762 was teaching Edison, Swift, Shakespeare, and Milton. Well, we in India have been also teaching that for a long time. It's only when firebrands like Akshay came along, that things began to change. Revolutions came in the department of English as such. But it took a long time coming. I think there's never a single story in the world. A single story smacks of some kind of tyranny, some kind of a dominance. You had the 9/11, for instance, recently, and that became a single story in the world, the thing that history has changed after 9/11. But I think they were wrong because they forgot to tell the story in Chile. They forgot to tell the story in Somalia. I thought there were stories in Rwanda, Syria, far more serious than what happened at 9/11. But then, narrative and discourse, as you know, is part of the very disproportionate kind of power structures that operate in society. But there are three stories that I have in mind that I want to tell you. And I'm telling you these three stories because we felt the electromagnetic waves coming and touching us, the refractions of what happened. The first refraction, I think, that really took place was a scathing, notorious kind of blistering debate between C.P. Snow and F.R. Leavis. I'm talking of this particular story because this story becomes very important, I think, in the context of the two cultures controversy. There are actually the Richmond lectures given at Downing Street in 1962. And remember that C.P. Snow wrote his Two Cultures and the Scientific Revolution in 1959, when he walked on that cold morning into the Senate Hall at Cambridge. He was to actually introduce a phrase which seems to have gone into the bloodstream of generations to come. And I think that it is more important now, that debate. And it's more important now because of the forces of new liberalism that seem to be coming, the corporate sector, and technocrats overtaking the world. Stephen Collini, in fact, has done a very good analysis of this whole debate. He's a senior professor whom I happened to meet many, many years ago of modernism. What I'm really pointing out in this debate is the admonishment of Snow by F.R. Leavis. Remember, F.R. Leavis was a very angry man, full of rage. Somewhere I think that's what we all would like to be. If you look at the ethics of our profession, the only way that you really change things is when you create a kind of an angry readership, when you can ask people to hit back at you. But Huxley, after the lecture at Richmond, at Downing Street, Huxley was of the opinion that this was a very violent and ill-mannered lecture that he gave on C.P. Snow. But what I think is important is to revisit and resurrect him. It might be that C.P. Snow is a kind of a person, not many people now talk about it, but I think it becomes very important. And I again give credit to the English department that it has it on its course now also. And that's one of the reasons that I thought that I must touch on a text which to me became very important and is important now because of my adversarial kind of position against the onslaught of a very technocratic world which has put social sciences and humanities in the background. We don't have any funding, for instance, at all. If you look at Snow's personality, I think Leavis is mocking him. And not only mocking, he's actually full of rage. He's fuming. He's angry at him. He's angry, I think, for a number of reasons, especially as a man that he is. Snow, in fact, is self-importantly ignorant, to use F.R. Leavis's words. He thinks of himself as a novelist. But as a novelist, F.R. Leavis says, he does not exist. He doesn't begin to exist, he says. And why so? He thinks that he only tells rather than shows. He only speaks. He doesn't show it. Snow has never been a scientist. He just drifted into it, like many of us drifted into English literature, I think. But he also drifted into it, left it, became a novelist. I, in fact, when I started off my research, I thought I would research on C.P. Snow. But I found him dull. I didn't find him engaging. And I think the only thing that you find in him is that there's really a certain kind of a knowledgeableness in him. The word that Stephen Collini uses. That when you try to be very knowledgeable, which you are not, it's more of kind of pomposity. But that's very important in our present day culture and culture of the celebrity that you have, which I shall touch upon now. But what I want to emphasize is that one is going back to C.P. Snow and F.R. Leavis. But when you look at F.R. Leavis's scathing attack on Snow, more than the controversy there, I think what is more important is that F.R. Leavis is trying to actually show the style of such pomposity in culture. I think his essay actually become a classic essay of cultural criticism, because he's looking at the world around and putting Snow there as a representative of a certain class. If you look at Snow's view in a moment, we go to F.R. Leavis, but if you look at Snow, it is a tussle between who? The natural scientists and the traditional intellectuals. And the traditional intellectuals, which he calls Luddites. And who are the Luddites? Luddites are the persons who are vigorously, violently against any kind of progress. And they're violently against any kind of progress because they think it's taking away their jobs. They are the ones who rebelled against machinery, tore it down in the 18th century. But Snow regards technology as the best answer to mankind's fundamental problems. This goal, he thinks, has been disturbed, basically. If there's a balance, he thinks it should be all right. And I also think that there should be a balance. But he goes on to talk about the gap of ignorance by the Luddites about what's happening to science and what it's doing for us. What I'm saying is that Snow is blaming the literary intellectuals. Well, there's something happening in the world today, in most of the democratic countries. The intellectuals is a word that seems to be a negative connotations in it. You are an urban Naxalite, so to say, is what you are if you try to be an intellectual. You're a hypocrite. So that's what C.P. Snow, as an almighty person embedded in science and fiction, thinks that here is a way of going at the English departments and humanities and social science. The other day, and I was actually lecturing into the Indian diaspora in Washington a few days back, and I was, in fact, asked by a scientist. He said, "Why don't you go to the mountains and be poetry while we are on the job, while we look after the world and science?" In fact, that is what C.P. Snow is also saying. Intellectuals all the time bleating and grumbling. Maybe that's what we are doing now. But maybe bleating and grumbling can draw attention somewhere. But the scientist is on the job. So Lewis's view, I think, is actually not denying the importance of science. He's not denying, really, the fact that what should be the balance in academics. Should we have science or should we? He's not bothered about that, really. What he's saying is that there is a lack of an effective educated public. And I think that's a very significant point, because when there is a lack of an educated, effective public, which is capable of distinguishing, which is capable of discriminating, then obviously that kind of a nation needs literature, needs the arts. Science cannot do it. And I think he makes this kind of a point really interestingly, because C.P. Snow was inducted by Harold Wilson into the cabinet in 1964. And he became part of the British cabinet without any experience in politics. So here was a man that C.P. Snow was talking in terms of that if such a man could have adulation from the political leaders, then obviously that country lacks educated public. And my implications you must be understanding, all of you. What I'm saying is that there is too much of superficial treatment of cultural matters across the world, because all that we learn are in fashion magazines or in kind of media or journalism of very second-rate nature. There is no serious development of critical standards, is really the point that F.R. Leavis is making, and I think is absolutely right. Economic prosperity is not being emphasized because that's not exclusively the end of social life. So the argument holds ground today also in a world which is totally neoliberal and crassly consumerist. The attack is really on Snow's tone and style. And mind you, when you become condescending and you become lofty, you view your own talent in such a manner, then what happens? Such a public then gives you differential attention. It begins to look up to you. It happens with politicians. Celebrities, nature, and cultural authority gained by Snow, I think, is responsible for his reputation for many years. All performance and no substance at all. I wonder if Snow really has been put to that kind of a scathing attack as such, but when you look at it, he has no doubts of what he is saying. Not skeptical of what he is saying. And whenever anyone begins to be so presumptuous as to think that he's telling the gospel truth, then I think the attention that is accorded to him is ill-deserved. It's not sort of something that he deserves. And I think it's very important that you don't stipulate definitions. You don't stipulate and say, this is good, this is bad. I think whenever you stipulate, there is no deep thinking in it. There's absolutely no thinking. The cultural critic cultivates, he arouses, he spurs you on. But nowhere does Snow does that or achieve that. Parading abstract nouns, you cannot really achieve anything by saying, what is economic prosperity good for? What for? What ultimately for? What ultimately do men live for? They obviously live for money, as he's trying to say. Totally define it. And if you can sort of define it in terms of concrete, mathematical forms, then I think he's mistaken, because life cannot be described in that manner. It cannot be. What is important, I think, is the attentiveness to language and how it functions, which Snow isn't, because he's not a playwright, a novelist, nor a scientist as such. And having some kind of distracting fastidiousness about it. Embodiment of positive values are the people who are active, but he is not active at all. Therefore, I think what F.R.Leavis was doing really was giving a lecture on the whole essay being a document of the study of cliché. Repeat it. This is not good. This is bad. Technology, progress. What F.R.Leavis really calls it is the currency value. And currency value is when you spread it around, used often. People begin to believe in it. And I'm saying this, it happens in the world of fashion, it happens in the world of politics. The goals of life seen by Leavis are to be well defined, whereas by Snow are to be well defined. F.R.Leavis thinks you cannot be definitive about it. Who can really define what goals of life are? I think cultural criticism has a better potential, has a better status to define it. The picture of adequate human fulfillment given by cultural criticism. So the challenges and dilemma of cultural criticism that I kind of inculcated from that kind of a lecture many years ago when one read it, finding a platform of a mode of expression to ensure that platform, you find a mode of expression to ensure that there is a wide dissent. There is a claimed kind of assumptions which need to be challenged. And secondly, cultural criticism which uses a mechanism to bring down a celebrity who is transmuted into authority. A celebrity transmuted into an authority. And he needs to be punctured. And how do you puncture him then? You puncture him, not what Huxley said, I think, when he said he's ill-mannered. What F.R.Leavis is really trying to do, and I'm no fan of F.R.Leavis because of his great tradition and imposing that on the third world, because all English studies was because of F.R.Leavis. Though, incidentally, I'm reminded of a joke in the department we were sitting having tea, and a lot of us used to sit together in the olden days. There were Marxists and leftists and radicals, very bold people engaging in political conversation. I don't think you have that now in the English department. I pity you to a certain extent. But what I mean to say is that in that kind of a setup in the English department, I remember we talking and we talked about, and they were all old timers like me, though I'm not old. I think I'm just pretending to be old. But what I'm actually saying is that when I mentioned F.R.Leavis, a colleague there said, "Who is F.R.Leavis?" Now I thought at that moment that a person doesn't deserve to be in the English department if he doesn't know about F.R.Leavis. And I said, my answer to that question was that F.R.Leavis is the captain of the English cricket team. And that person believed it. And maybe that person still thinks that F.R.Leavis is the captain of the English team. So what happens is, what I'm saying is, you need to use critical tactics. And the critical tactics are belittle disparage. And that's what Snow-Leavis was doing with C.P. Snow. Punch, give him a punch. Be concise. There are many suitable targets for this in cultural studies, I think. The over-abstractions that you find in official documents can be targeted in the same way. Fashion-driven chatter. And then you have advertising and marketing. Meaningless kind of exercise. And then you have the very coercive kind of tendentious literature. So these are the kind of targets which can be put under a very caustic kind of critique. So closer attention, my idea of bringing up this controversy is that there has to be a closer attention to the ways words mean and mislead, express truths, vilify, obstruct. And we need to sort of really find a certain kind of imagination to counter that, a kind of an anesthesia that it creates on some of our minds, and we begin to fall into the trap. One very good analogy used by Stephen Collini, the Cambridge scholar, to my mind, was the slow food analogy. You know, people stop in the West going to fast food joints anymore because they've had enough. I remember a number of years ago, you would date a girl, or a girl would date a boy, not by going to the loud discotheque cellars and cafes, which made a lot of music, sound. You can't converse there. So serious couples were really in love, went to very quiet places that they could converse. So the analogy that he is trying to use, Collini, is slow criticism. And slow criticism is kind of something very different from science, which sort of strikes, lays out all the mathematical formulas straight away. What I'm trying to say is that slow criticism means indirection, arrest, cause readers to come out of slowly, out of something that they very consistently hold on to. Ask them to come out of it. Being reflective, probing, not some kind of a formula that you give to them and they learn. And therefore, you are disturbed into an awareness, I think. It's a kind of a defamiliarization somewhere, I think, to my mind. I don't know. Akshay could correct me, but good, sharp criticism can disturb. And when you have this kind of a pompous performer, then I think that would be the only idiom for him. And my emphasis today is that it's very relevant for the generations to come, to look behind the rhetoric, to see who is sincere and who isn't, for ourselves at least. And I think if you are evaluative enough, you can really read between the lines, or you can read the subterranean meanings of it. That was my number one story. The number two story that I want to tell you is a story with which my life also, I'm also entangled in it. And maybe you could say it's my story too. And my story in the sense is that when we were kind of growing up and I joined the department for a number of years, I remember suddenly Alan Bloom came on the scene. And when Alan Bloom came on the scene, he had written a book in 1987, Closing of the American Mind. It was a right-wing account of the importance of traditional pedagogy, constricted, very constricted. My generation of the 60s that I belong to, luckily I belong to the generation of the 60s, always had convictions of relativism, always had convictions of of the idea of plurality. We agreed with the whole idea of diversity. I think maybe that the reason for that, one of the reasons was that we had a colleague here who was very much on the left, one Mr. Razdan. And we had a colleague here also, and they were kind of, card holders of the Communist Party. And they were good people who spurred you on. And therefore, in that kind of an environment, there, I remember that in a classroom, when Razdan would come to teach, he would talk about other things beyond the essay that was given to them to teach in the syllabus. But he would relate it. He would go to the European texts. He would talk about art. But he very seldom touched what was in the syllabus. So he was reported to the chairperson. And they said, he doesn't teach us the syllabus. I was reminded of Sudhir Chandra, who said, he was asked, have you completed the syllabus? And his answer was, what syllabus? At the end of the semester. He said, I don't know any syllabus. What are you talking of? I think it's the same vein as Rabindranath Tagore's Vishwa Bharati. If you read the constitution of it, it specifically says, do not suffocate the children with a curriculum. Curriculum is very suffocating. Let them decide. Let redesigning of syllabus takes place on each level of the teacher in consultation with the students, not something that is imposed on you. The generation of 60s, therefore, found him hilarious. He's talking of a thing which was totally contradictory. I think it was totally a lopsided philosophy of his, paradoxical completely. Paul Bellow, that I was doing research on, hilariously depicted Alan Bloom in his novel Revelstein. And what does he, Revelstein, the hero, what does he represent? He's a dandy, upper class, loves classical music, Panjab, always dresses up in a suit, has that kind of academic snobbery about him, not being able to speak the language of the students and relate to them. Uncompromising confidence in nativism became his rather rational doctrine of upholding the democratic structures of his nation. Innumerable such characters are there in the English departments all around. And as Akshay is the only one I can see on the screen, I think I'm just speaking to him really, but there are few faces here and there. But what I'm saying is innumerable such characters in the departments, because I also, at one stage early on in life, one day, fine day, I wrote down a paper in Commonwealth literature. That time there was no post-colonial. And I went to the chairperson. And when I went to the chairperson, I showed him the course and I said, I'll go to Hyderabad on my own. I'll buy my own ticket. I'll get things photocopied and I'll bring them back, put them in the library, and we'll start a course in Commonwealth literature. And he read my paper, my page, and he just threw it on the table and it slid towards me and then flew off the table down to pick it up. Very discourteous. I came back and spoke to the department. Incidentally, after a few weeks, he had to resign. Not because of me, because he had misbehaved in the same way with another colleague also. Very obnoxious. More English than the English. Very antithetical to a kind of a revolutionary pedagogy of Paulo Ferreira. Very narrow perspective that he had, like Bloom. Not that teamwork and cultural amalgamation, something that doesn't fit into a narrow perspective of people like Bloom or many people in the English department. The aftermath of the Suez crisis in 1956, together with the reprimand of Britain by America to come out of Egypt, and a kind of a crack on its knuckles, when Pax Britannica dies out, comes to an end, and Pax Americana takes over. The end of the British Empire, of the Bandung Conference in 1955. And I'm saying this, these were the little refractions taking place, and very significant refractions to me as a person in the English department. Because gradually, when these refractions reached us, we also began to interrogate Western civilization, Western centrism, prejudice that they had against the East. Around those years, Aimé Césaire's discourse of colonialism came up. Then Fanon's black skin, white masks came out. And Orientalism, as all of you know. And all of them targeted Western-centric perspectives. Many liberal thinkers, therefore, I think, saw through the paradox of the view of the closing of the mind. Because the argument that he was taking was, you can't teach them black literature. You can't teach them world literature. You can't outrightly teach them feminism, according to Bloom, because you have to preserve your own culture. He thought it was vulgarizing the nation. Therefore, when you talk in terms of closing the mind of the youth, and he was saying it's the American and the closing of the mind, his book, it was closing of the mind really by shutting out all other literatures that he was propounding. He was doing the traditional pedagogy. He was emphasizing the traditional canon and throwing out all black studies, everything, out of the window. A caricature of a traditional order, that's what I think he became, when he denounced feminist studies and gay, and looked at the vulgarizing intellectual disposition of people who revolted against tradition. I think the crisis in the liberal education to him amounted to the crisis of civilization, he thought. The civilization was under danger. And why not, if our civilization has been in danger? The radical ideology of socialist liberalism, he was allergic to. And it's right so, if he was. Good for him. So, education system infused sharply with class prejudices was being revolted against by black literature, by the Asian literature, and he was against it. Because class prejudice to them, to people like Bloom, was very important as such. So students of my generation went on to stage demonstrations against elitism. You can see the 60s was very, very volatile. The academic and administrative affairs of governance were controlled, and they wanted to sort of hit out at that. And if they wanted to hit out at that, I think that's exactly what's happening across the world right now also. Demonstrations by radicals. It's being repeated in Vishwabharati, as you might have read, too. What Bloom followers believed in, and they sort of termed many of us as fanaticism of plurality. They called it the fanaticism of plurality. They called it the absolutism of equality. And to use Tocqueville, the great historian, it was a reversion to the passion for equality. Passion for equality. Reversion to that. Outrageous and reactionary attack, I think. And finally, it was very interesting that Noam Chomsky nailed it. The last nail in his coffin was by him. He thought, and he wrote on it also, where he said, it's a mind-bogglingly stupid thesis that Bloom was talking of. And it was mind-boggling stupid because he said that Bloom thinks that you walk people through these texts, a few of them, Edison and Eliot and others, and you think that you've given them knowledge, but actually you have taught them nothing. No understanding, virtually nothing, he said. Maybe he was exaggerating, because one did learn a bit of culture, civilization. Bloom was valorizing the hierarchical systems of traditional knowledge, whereas we people now in the third world are against it. The education system limited to a minority was a lopsided thesis, that education would be with the minority and they will look after the nation. Rather provocative, bizarre reason. It reminded me of Helen Gardner's rebuke of George Steiner. Poor fellow died a few years ago, the last of the Mohicans, great critic. And what did she do? Rejected and rebuked his thesis. Why did she rebuke the thesis when he walked in for his final viva with her? She said, sorry, there is no comparative literature which exists in the rubric of English studies. It doesn't exist. It's not there. Instantaneously, I think Helen Gardner flashes into my mind as being a representative of Bloom, though a great Miltonic scholar. Wonderful, and enjoyed reading her. So we have to persuade the faculty towards liberal views in cultural studies too, as Akshay would know. Many of them. Across the university, people came to quarrel with me in the syndicate, saying cultural studies are part of sociology. Forget it. Why should English department be called cultural studies? Almost, I think, 2 or 3 meetings in the syndicate. But I happen to get my word across and have them persuade. Somewhere English professors also succeed in their arguments, if not everywhere. But I do remember the University of California was one of the first to stand up against the great Titian and Alan Bloom when they introduced I. Rigoberto Menchú, a great writing by Rigoberto, a text that I still read sometimes, written by a person who doesn't know reading or writing, just dictated it, and then it was translated. A new course titled Culture and Value began on race theory, literature from Africa, Asia, Latin America, at the University of California at Santa Cruz. And interestingly, I do not know if I have the time. Akshay, do I have the time? I thought that maybe I could read out to you. I can't hear you.
Waiting for the third story.
Waiting for the third story was my own story.
Okay.
Into Bloom.
Okay.
Where I went and the idea that we did sort of manage to bring cultural studies, because I do remember, to add a bit of another note, not that I'm taking credit for it, but I think on the day that I do not know whether Akshay remembers, but on the day that I took over as a chairperson, I proposed that let's change the name of the department from English department, and I said we don't want English, but many people in the department came at my neck and said that that is too elitist. They were making the same paradox as Bloom, because I thought cultural studies was anti-elitist completely. If you look at the roots of it, which go back to Frankfurt School and go back to Raymond Williams and Terry Eagleton, if you were to look at the roots, and Sassurian linguistics. So the Asian, Middle Eastern literatures therefore became very important as such. Thus, a crisis in the humanities, I think, became fertile ground for multidisciplinary program, intertextual program. uniformly legitimate. And what I really wanted to say, I'm not elaborating on the idea of cultural studies, which many of you must be knowing, or maybe during the question answer thing we could talk about it. But I'm saying that the reflection on the aesthetics of language and using a certain kind of somewhere having lost the capability of having that aesthetic sensibility, we are faced by a crisis. And I think the crisis really is what the professor in that novel, Coetzee's novel, what is the name of the novel? Yeah, the Coetzee's novel, Disgrace. He says, can we keep a pure imagination? He says, can we keep a pure imagination and not let the question, he says, before us is to have a pure imagination and not have reality come on us, the onslaught of it. Keep that away. Protect ourselves against the onslaught of reality. Have pure imagination completely. So the answer, the question is, can we find a way that two can exist together? Can we find a way that two can exist together? And finally, let me end on a note by Terry Eagleton, where he says that the paradox of English studies really is, Terry Eagleton says interestingly, that the colonized and the dispossessed people will inherit literary studies, will inherit not the earth, but will inherit literary earth, will inherit the literary earth. Joyce's rejection of English literature also, tradition, and moving on to other literatures and going beyond it, he thinks that that is the main source of his talent, the rejection of the English tradition. And his saying, so important, his wonderful expression of what an artist should be, especially Stephen Dedalus' words, which say, I will not do anything which I don't believe. Let me stop here and leave it to you.
Okay.
Can you?
Yeah. So, once again, a very, what I say, rich, but by no such imagination, Shelley, was this an evidence of slow criticism?
Yeah.
It was not an evidence of slow criticism. It was a because the kind of challenge that he had to cover a trajectory of so many years, and many things that he flagged, which are very important. One, of course, is slow criticism. After all, science does create, when we talk in terms of impact factor, science creates that impact which is immediately visible, but humanities has that incremental kind of a penetration. It takes time before we realize what impact humanities makes on us. Other thing that which he has been saying all these years, angry readership, in fact even angry pedagogy. Because when we teach, this is what we always used to practice, and we still practice in a way, and Shelley used to be in that context. He used to champion that classroom is a site where you have to create that kind of environment where students are agitated enough. They begin to probe, and they are not just easy status quoists. They don't take things in a very, so to say, routine manner. So in his lecture, you have seen that how he has traversed this journey, and 3 stories. Of course, that point is well taken, that there cannot be a single story. English studies, the making English studies has to be, if at all it is to be sketched or historicized, then there are multiple stories, competing stories. C.P. Snow and F.R. Lewis and Shelley, we have introduced both of them in the same unit. We hope that controversy and that dialogue would be reenacted in our classrooms to the benefit of students. Then you refer to the closing of American Mind, maybe next